Hello, and thank you for joining us here on the Neutral Zone. I am Phil Milani, joined as always by my trusty sidekick, my partner in crime. Really, the best way to describe this person is my everything. It's at Eric Dalala.
Phil, good to see you. Are you feeling okay?
I'm not feeling okay. I'm very emotionally torn inside, Eric. I will say that.
I bet you are, and we're here for you.
Thank you. Hopefully, this will be a therapeutic podcast. I'll say that. Just a lot to get to here on a busy Monday in Broncos country. Of course, the big news on this Monday, the day after the 2020 season has come to a close, is that John Elway is moving out of his GM role, will still serve as the Broncos president of football operations, but the Broncos now officially searching for a new general manager. John Elway, Vic Fangio, Joe Ellis will all be a part of that search committee here as the Broncos head into some new ground here moving forward. We'll break it all down. Why did John Elway make this decision right now? What went into his decision-making process there? And then how will this search committee sell the Broncos job to a potential general manager? Eric, there's a lot to consider there. You know, the Broncos, with the Broncos ownership situation right now, obviously 4 consecutive losing seasons. Why would somebody who is desirable, a hot name out there, why would they want to come join this Broncos squad? And then also, what does this mean for some of the big decisions that are looming for the Broncos this offseason? Of course, you know, we'll start at the quarterback position. What does it mean for Drew Lock? We know that John Elway was very much in Drew Lock's corner, letting him develop, letting him continue to grow. John Elway even said on Monday that he still thinks that Drew Lock has the capabilities to become a heck of a quarterback in the NFL. So what does it mean for him? What does it mean for Von Miller? A big decision that's coming up, for Von Miller heading into the final season of his contract. So we'll break it all down on this episode of the Neutral Zone, Eric.
Let's get to it.
Are you ready?
Let's do it.
Well, I was going to say, as always, if you'd like to be a part of Neutral Zone, you could leave a voicemail, 707-NEUTRAL. Please leave a voicemail. I don't think we'll have time to get to them this episode, but maybe later in the week we'll have some voicemails from fans as the season wraps up. Eric, they can also write an email.
That's right. They can leave an email at neutralzoneshow@gmail.com. Looking forward to some thoughts later in the week.
Yeah, please leave an email or even just leave a comment right below if you're watching this on YouTube, or hit us up on Twitter. It's at Eric Dalala with an A, at Phil Milani with a PH. Very non-traditional spellings there. But Eric, we don't have time to be silly on this episode. We've got to get right into our first topic of conversation. And that was, were you surprised when the news broke today about John Elway moving out of the GM's role?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I think that if you weren't surprised, you're lying. And, there's been some reports on TV and that there's been rumblings about this. I don't really think that that's true. I think this has been kept pretty quiet. John Elway's had a few discussions. He mentioned he talked to Ozzie Newsome, who was in a similar role in Baltimore. And obviously he's talked about it with Joe Ellis, but this is kept under wraps for good reason. To me, it feels similar to 2016 when Gary Kubiak stepped away from the head coaching job after a conversation he had with John Elway. So yeah, this it came out of left field. I would say it makes sense from the perspective that I've always kind of thought when John would move on from the GM role, it wouldn't be to leave entirely, or it wouldn't be somebody pushing him out. It would be him choosing to move into another role or choosing to step away. And so in that sense, I think it does make sense. And I think it's a good thing that he'll be around. He does still have 10 years of experience. He knows what this organization is like. He's taken this team to the mountaintop. Obviously, they haven't been able to get back in recent years, but I think having his ability to weigh in when it matters, that'll be a valuable asset to whoever comes in.
Yeah, and I mean, even Joe Ellis, the Broncos president and CEO, on Monday was quoted in a statement and said, John Elway is the most important and impactful person in the history of the Denver Broncos. I mean, that is spot on. And, Eric, I was a little bit surprised by this move, and I talked to John every single week during the season. I've talked to him every single week for the past 6 seasons. And so I never got any sort of inclination from him that he was going to be thinking about, moving out of that GM role. But I will say the only thing now that I look back on it is that after the losses, he wasn't quite as upset as usual. Like sometimes heading into those interviews, I would say, okay, how am I going to phrase this so that, it doesn't come off the wrong way? I don't want him to be upset, not that his competitiveness wasn't quite the same. I think it was still obviously high. It's just that he wasn't quite as edgy after a loss, as he had been the last couple of years. So, but I will say it was a surprise, but it makes sense. He's 60 years old. He mentioned that in his press conference, and that he said that today, this Monday, he had his seventh grandchild was born. So I think there's a lot of reasons why this move makes sense for John. We see how he spends the off periods. There's not many off periods in the NFL calendar. It's not just from August to January that they're doing this, and then a little bit of stuff at the draft. It's all year round. John is part of the competition committee. He's got a lot of league-wide responsibilities there. So, it's a year-round job, and it's very demanding. But the few off periods that we do see, he's out spending time with his family. He's out on a lake somewhere, hanging out. Those are the kind of things that John likes to do. And he mentioned that in his press conference that he's worked hard his whole life. Now he wants to be able to enjoy some of the fruits of his labor a little bit. And I don't think you could blame the guy.
No, definitely not. I mean, I think that it makes sense from his perspective. He talked a lot about family. And I thought maybe one of the key points, and who knows if this is true or not, Phil, because you always got to take it with a grain of salt. But he was asked if the Broncos were 13-3 this year, would you still make the same decision? He said he probably would. He'd been thinking about this for a couple of years. And that sounds to me, Phil, again, the same way that we heard from Gary Kubiak a few years ago when he said, this is a thing I've been thinking about all season. It was just time to make that choice. The difference here being there's no health issue with John Elway compared with Gary Kubiak. But yeah, I think it makes sense to take that next step. I think it's good for the organization. He's still going to be involved in some capacity, not just leaving cold turkey. So now all the attention turns to who comes in and what happens now.
Yeah, exactly. Fans will, I've already got some buzz on Twitter that people are saying, sure, this was all about family. This sure, it had nothing to do with football. I genuinely think that it has to do with family and personal reasons here for John. I really don't think that it has anything to do with the 4 consecutive losing seasons. I do think that this team is heading in a positive direction, Eric, despite a 5-11 season in 2020. I do think that there's some signs that we'll talk about in later shows, but I do think that it's nice that John will still be around to make big picture decisions, is what he said. It seems like all roster decisions, the draft, these types of things will be left to the new general manager. He said that there's not going to be a list of items that the new general manager has to come in and do. He's going to be able to create his own staff. Like John's not saying, hey, you have to just step into this role and keep everybody who I already have. He said he's going to be an advocate for his staff, but this new GM is going to come in and do things his way, but John will still be around to make big picture items. And Eric, I think that leads to the next point is, do you think that John will be able to take this step back and sort of relinquish some of the controls?
I think he's going to have to. And I think something that would help with that is, there's some names floating around, an Adam Peters, for example, guys that have worked in Denver before. I think it would help with that transition to have John be able to take a step back if they hire somebody who has not been here, because I think there's a natural inclination when you've worked with someone before, when you've been someone's boss before, that maybe you're having a discussion about Von Miller, and we'll get to him, but maybe John disagrees with the new GM. And if it's someone who's worked here before, is there that tendency to overrule in that certain circumstance? And so I do think there's a benefit to starting fresh, having somebody that can come in. You're going to have to empower them to make these decisions, because it's kind of Phil, so much is made, and I think for good reason, about the relationship between a head coach and a GM. in the Broncos, as they're pitching this, you're pitching Vic Fangio as our head coach. You know, he's a defensive guy, so you need somebody that aligns with that. And so to put other restrictions in place, whether it's, you know, John is going to overrule you in certain places, or you've got to make this decision, that's just going to hinder you in finding the best candidate. And, you know, Phil, when I read the release and I read the statements initially, I thought this was going to be a situation where John was still in the building day to day, where he was still in every meeting, where he was still making lots of decisions and had a lot on his plate. To hear him talk in his press conference, it didn't really sound like that. It kind of sounded more like he would be in from time to time, you know, maybe in every day during the season. But to me, it sounded less like, you know, every single little trade or roster move or whatever would be something that he would weigh in on. And so, and he sounded at peace with that also is important. And so I do think John will be able to step back and say, hey, whoever we hire, let's let them do their job. You got to find someone qualified and competent, of course, but when you get that person, let them do their job.
Yeah, he's still the president of football operations, so he's obviously has to be involved. It's just that the workload and the time that goes into being the GM and making every decision it's time, you know, it's a huge workload. Do you know what I mean? I guess that's the best way to put it, is that, you know, some of these things that fans don't really pay attention to, little transaction moves, little roster changes here or there. These are all things that go by his desk, you know, and it's not just who are we going to take at 9 with the number 9 pick. You know, it's not just what are we going to do with Justin Simmons? You know, those are the big things that fans really care about. But to build a whole roster, to know all the practice squad guys, to keep tabs on what's going on around the league, to keep tabs on all the college guys, you know, it's a lot of work. And so he'll still be involved, but it sounds like maybe just taking a step back and the workload reducing a little bit. But, you know, getting to how do you sell this team to GM candidates. I agree with you. I think that it would help working with somebody who knows John on a personal level. Although Elway was asked about that on Monday and said that they're going to start wide here. He said,
well, that's what I'm saying. I think the opposite. I think it's better someone who does not.
Oh, does not? Oh, really?
Yeah, just because I think that empowers that person. And if you have somebody who has worked for John before, I think that sets up an existing power dynamic that maybe you don't want.
I was going to say just somebody who maybe he has a familiarity with and and they have a familiarity with him, that it'll just be, maybe there's already a lot of trust there. There's already a good working relationship where John doesn't feel like he needs to be in those because he knows, look, this guy's got it, is what I was thinking. Of course, the wide net, Eric, like from your perspective here, guys like John Dorsey come to mind that, you know, they've been a GM in this league for a long time and currently not doing that, but maybe could come in and fill that role. There's other guys who are up and comers around the league, you know, people who are in second in command, like in Kansas City or in Indianapolis, places that have done good jobs recently. And then the names that are familiar with John Elway, Adam Peters, like you mentioned, worked under John for a long time here in Denver. He's currently the vice president of player personnel in San Francisco. That was a big move when Adam Peters left the Broncos to go there because, you know, John Lynch and John Elway, obviously friends, and Elway allowed Adam Peters to take that promotion there going to the 49ers. Another name to pay attention to, John Spytek. He is the director of player personnel for the Tampa Bay Bucks. Spent a long time here in Denver as a national scout. Got to know him a little bit when he was here. That's another name that has popped up. And even a guy like Champ Kelly, who is the assistant director of player personnel for the Chicago Bears. He spent a long time here in Denver working with John. So those are some names that you could see pop up. But Eric, you know, selling this team to some of these guys who are unfamiliar with the Broncos might be a little bit difficult just considering the state of things at the moment.
Yeah, and before I get to that, Phil, I will say that a couple of years ago when the Broncos hired Vance Joseph, and then I think even really when they first started looking at Vic Fangio, those were names that were not necessarily on those immediate initial radars. And so it's possible that somebody, a name comes up here in the next day or two or week or whatever that nobody's talking about right now. That doesn't mean that the Broncos are settling for a candidate. They just might have different people in mind. So important to keep that in mind. And I will say in that regard, I think the partnership with Vic Fangio is at least as important as the one between the new GM and John Elway, just because I think you hope John Elway said he wants to be here. He would be open to being here past 2021, but that's not a guarantee. And you hope that Vic Fangio is able to keep the job. And so, finding someone that works well with him that can be here for the next few years, that's important as well. But yeah, Phil, getting to your point about what makes this an attractive job or what would make it not an attractive job, I think you're coming into a situation where obviously 5 seasons without playoffs, the ownership situation is uncertain, although I did think that John Elway answered that pretty well when he said that has not impacted our ability to spend, to fund what we need to do. I think the Broncos have still been competitive in that area and have not been hampered in free agency or anything like that.
He said it was the same as when Pat Bowen was, involved in the day-to-day. He said every resource was still available to them.
Exactly. I think from a positive standpoint, there is a lot of young talent with Bradley Chubb, Justin Simmons, if you're able to bring him back, Noah Fant, Dalton Reisner, Jerry Jeudy, KJ Hamler, Cortland Sutton. You can go on and on. The biggest thing, Phil, when you look at the other GM openings, if it's a place like Jacksonville or Atlanta or Detroit, those places have quarterbacks in place or have a route to a quarterback. And so you're going to have to convince whoever this GM is, either Drew Lock is that guy or that they need to have a plan or that you're open to that plan to find a quarterback. Because, Phil, ultimately, job security in the NFL comes down to which teams have a quarterback and can consistently win. And so I think if I'm making a pitch, it's that you're going to have all the resources. We're here to support you. We've got young talent. We've got the 9th overall pick and can get more. We think Drew can be the guy, but when we find someone who is, who plays at even an average level in that position, we're going to be right in this thing. And I think it is close to a win now job, even if, maybe it's a playoff contention now job and not a Super Bowl win now type job.
As we record this podcast, Eric, on this Monday, there are currently 7 GM openings around the NFL. The Broncos, the Panthers, the Lions, Texans, Falcons, Jaguars, and the Washington football team. So there is going to be competition to find, a top name out there that's going to help lead the Broncos moving forward here. I'll say this person, whoever ends up coming in, will probably this is probably the most unique position, I would say, because when you come in as a general manager, I feel like you want to have your thumbprint on the team that you're leading. And the person who comes in here probably won't have that for a little while, at least for the foreseeable future, considering that Vic Fangio is going to be a part of this head coaching process. So it's not like a GM is going to come in and then hire his head coach. The head coach is already in place. And then, like you mentioned with Drew Lock, he's going to come in and there's a decision to be made there. But, assuming that they stick with Drew Lock, they're already going to have a quarterback that somebody else took. So this person, and this is why I thought maybe having a guy who knows John or they think about football in a similar way as John could be beneficial. But I do think that it's going to have to be a unique candidate who is okay with these things. They're okay working and reporting for John Elway. But what makes this a desirable job is just, I would have to just say, the tradition here in Denver, knowing that the fan base is one of the more passionate fan bases in the NFL, knowing that there's a tradition of winning here, the expectations are high here, and the organization is going to give you every opportunity to win. I think that all of those things make this a desirable job. And you mentioned the young guys and the general direction that this team is taking. If you evaluate this roster as a general manager candidate and like the players that are here, then I think that you'll like this job.
Yeah, I do think it's unique in that it's not the rebuild has started. It's not a complete rebuild. You look at a team like Jacksonville, whoever they hire, or a team like Atlanta or a team like Detroit that might strip things all the way down. Those are different situations. The Broncos have started to work their way back up, even though it may not have resulted in wins this year. I find it hard to believe that whoever comes in as GM is going to get rid of Cortland Sutton and Bradley Chubb and Jerry Jeudy. I mean, and Noah Fant. Those to me are key pieces that have already been selected that are going to stay here. And so you have to find someone who is comfortable with that style of player, those particular players that you can move forward with and build kind of off the, it's not we're not building off a 3-story house right now, but whatever the few feet of foundation you have, you've got to have someone that is comfortable building off that instead of starting over. Now I think, Phil, that the investment in Drew Lock is not as much as it might be in Jerry Jeudy or Noah Fant or Cortland Sutton or Bradley Chubb. I think those guys are more likely to stay just because they've proven they can play at a consistent high level. So to me, I think that you might get a new general manager who comes in and decides we're going to take a quarterback with the 9th pick, or we're going to move up and get somebody, or we're going to, trade for a veteran. I think that's certainly within their wheelhouse and their, ability to make decisions. John Elway said as much on Monday. He said there'd be no pre-existing like check marks that you had to hit that included Drew has to be our quarterback. So that'll be interesting to see what happens there. And yeah, like you mentioned, Phil, the head coach part is interesting. That's why I said it's so important to find someone that meshes with him, because you're not coming into a brand new situation. There's a little more structure than most existing jobs.
Yeah, and even John Elway's right-hand man, Matt Russell, is departing as well, retiring. Spent 12 seasons with the Broncos, so he's even going to be departing now, and it's going to there's going to be a fresh approach definitely to the draft, and well, I'm assuming also to what happens here with free agency, as a new general manager comes in and wants to do things his way. But I also think that there's going to be a considerable amount of carryover, just considering that this guy, it's almost like John and Vic are like the pieces of bread, and this guy's going to come in and fill the sandwich. So ultimately it's still, if it's 2 pieces of rye bread, it's still a rye bread sandwich. It's just that the filling might be, instead of pastrami, maybe it's corned beef.
I think it's more like they're sitting down at the table for a nice like pot of spaghetti, and Vic and the new GM are at the table together. And then every once in a while, John will come over and say, like, how's your meal? Like, are you liking what you're having? Can I get you anything else? He's there to check on you, to make sure you're having a nice time and that things are going okay.
I see.
I think that on a day-to-day basis, and like in terms of who we talk to moving forward, who is kind of the voice for the decisions the front office makes, it's going to be presented as a partnership between Vic and the new GM, with John and kind of overseeing that whole process. I would be like, say the Broncos trade up from 9 to 5 and draft Justin Fields. I think that's a decision that will come from the new general manager, and John will sign off on, not a John suggesting this necessarily.
Yes. Yeah, I agree that it's going to be more of the GM's idea, but then John, maybe if it's a big picture item, will approve it. Yes. And we'll get into that in just a second here with Drew and Vaughn and the decisions that are upcoming. But Eric, interesting. You keep mentioning partnership with Vic Fangio. Normally in a normal situation or a normal structure, GM would be the head coach's boss. How do you see that playing out, especially considering that Vic is going to have some input here on who they hire as a GM?
I think it will work fine as long as they have the same approach. I think that's the case wherever you are, whether the GM is the boss or not. We've talked about that being an issue here, that this team has not kept the same coach. And so the players they're drafted have sometimes fit the system, sometimes not. I think you want to get on the same page and make sure that whoever the new GM is drafting players that are going to fit Vic's system, that they work hand in hand together. In that case, I think it's fine. I haven't really seen a power struggle in any way between Vic and John, or even the suggestion that Vic wishes he had more of a hand. I think Vic is very comfortable coaching the football team. And so to me, if you're a GM, that sets up well that you're going to do your job picking players with some input from Vic. He's going to do his job coaching the players. But, there are some coaches, as we know, Phil, that want to, even Vance Joseph mentioned it recently, that he wishes he would have had more of a role in player selection and that he wished he could have chosen his ingredients. I get the sense that, Vic wants to have input, but he doesn't want entire control the same way that like Matt Rule might get in Carolina, for example.
That's the old Bill Parcells line. If you're expecting him to cook the meal, let him pick the ingredients. But yeah, I think one situation where we've seen something similar is with the 49ers in Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch very much working as a partnership there in San Francisco. So that could be a model to look at. Eric, I wanted to mention one other name here that we haven't mentioned, and that is Peyton Manning. What do you think about that? You think he could come in and just have like some nostalgia going on, relive some of those glory days, let him and John just get in there and pick some guys?
I know that's going to be the popular thing that everyone wants to happen. And I kind of view the candidates in different categories. You've got the Adam Peters, the people who know John Elway. To me, I think that's great if that's the route you chose to go. To me, that's a continuation of what you're doing. And so the only thing I wonder is if it hasn't worked the last 4 or 5 years, and granted, I know that Adam Peters was not here over the last, I believe he left 4 years ago. I think he was here in 2016, if I'm remembering correctly, but might have left after the 2015 season. If you bring a guy like that in, who's kind of following the same pattern as John, is that what you want? And then there's the established GM, a guy like John Dorsey that you talked about. That's an interesting option. Then there's the Peyton, to me,
the unknown.
It is an unknown. And to me, that's risky for a team that needs to get back to the playoff. Obviously, the reward is really high, and we think that Peyton has incredible football IQ and would work really hard, but we just don't know what he's going to be. And I think that that's a little bit too much of a risk, at least in my mind. I'll be psyched if it happens. It'll be really cool. I think it'd be awesome for the organization, but I just wonder if that's the best move given how long of a playoff drought you have, considering you don't know if Peyton has that skill set or we don't know if Peyton wants to be a day-to-day GM. He might want to be in more of an overseeing role. Phil, one more group of people that's interesting to consider is like a Daniel Jeremiah or a Louis Riddick. We saw John Lynch go that route and have success. And he was just in the TV booth. He didn't even really do the evaluation the same way that Riddick and Jeremiah do, but that could be an interesting choice as well. I think you do get a benefit from that side of things in that they've talked to people around the league. They get the best of all the information around the NFL and could bring it to your team.
I think that when John says that they're going to cast a wide net, I would think that maybe a call to Peyton Manning would take place just to see if he's interested. We know that Elway filmed an episode of Peyton's Places with him. But I'm with you. I don't necessarily think that Peyton's probably interested in that. I think maybe he's a little more interested in that bigger role, if not TV. So
well, but what if Peyton says, I'll come be GM for a year, and then in 2022, when John Elway's contract expires, if John decides, hey, I'm going to step away now, Peyton did a nice job in his first year, could Peyton then take over as both?
Oh, now you're talking my language.
I think that's a little bit outside the realm of possibility. I think it's a little far-fetched.
I do. I think that might be a big dream, but
and I think
you never
know. You probably would have seen it floated already if that was the case.
What do you mean floated by who?
Like on Twitter, the same way that you see the Spy Tech and the Adam Peters.
I've seen Peyton Manning.
From your personal, from your bot accounts that you make, your burners. You're tweeting at yourself like higher.
Is Woody Page? Woody Page is not a burner.
No, it doesn't count.
Okay, all right. He did. Woody Page also listed some other names as like some up and coming guys, including Ed Dodds, who's with the Colts right now. I know you'd be excited about that, Eric. You big Colts fan. Isn't that you?
For the Denver Broncos.
Sorry.
I think you're confusing me with somebody else.
Eric, let's move on to our last point here, and that is there's some question marks facing whoever comes in here as general manager. Most notably, what are they going to do at the quarterback position? What's going to happen with Von Miller and Justin Simmons? Those are the three big things I think that a new GM is going to have to answer. Let's just start out with Drew. I mean, we heard Drew Lock talk this morning. He said that he feels confident that he is still going to be the guy here in Denver. I thought that he said all the right things, Eric. He said that, he feels that if he works hard this offseason, that he is going to come in here and light the world on fire essentially next year, and that, they'll have to take this job away from him. That's sort of the messaging. He didn't say it in as many words, but that's how I heard it in my brain, Eric. What do you think Drew is feeling like right now? And what do you think a new GM might be thinking?
I'd be a little nervous if I were him, I think. It's clear that John Elway's still in his corner, still says like, hey, I think Drew can be a really good quarterback. He's got to improve, but the talent is there. But there's just not a lot of patience in the NFL. And I think that if you bring in a new GM whose job is in many ways tied to the success of the quarterback, that new GM might say, hey, I want my own quarterback, or I want to choose who this guy is. And so, is it impossible that Drew is the quarterback next season? Absolutely not. But I think it's less likely now, or at least more likely that they bring somebody else in to compete with him and have a chance. So we'll have to see, but yeah, I think that the odds are probably still that that Drew is the day one starting quarterback in 2021. But I think the odds have dropped a little bit, maybe even considerably, given this news. Just because whoever the new GM is didn't draft him, and when that happens, it always opens you up to the possibility you could make a move.
Yeah. So I'll say something obvious. There's three options the Broncos can move forward with at the quarterback position. Either Drew Lock comes and is the quarterback. The Broncos could bring in a veteran, whether it's a trade or a free agent or something like that, to come in and be a quarterback, or they could draft a guy. Now, in my opinion, if you're not interested in letting Drew develop and see what can happen there, in my opinion, I think that almost eliminates drafting another good quarterback, in my mind, unless the new GM is just in love with one of these guys and is like all about it, So to me, it either seems like it's going to be Drew or one of these free agents or a trade here, a guy like a Matt Ryan, a Matt Stafford, somebody like that. If the new GM is like, look, I want to win now, I want to move forward with somebody like that. But if you make that kind of a move, Eric, financially, that either means goodbye Von Miller. Maybe that means definitely Jarrell Casey isn't back. AJ Boye isn't back. Things like that with this roster where you're going to have to find that money somewhere else. Justin Simmons maybe, or, and is it worth that? Is it worth it to say, we don't think Drew's ever going to get there. Let's bring in and make a trade for a guy like Matt Stafford or something. And to me, it's still not worth it. But the original question is, what is a new GM going to come in? How's Drew feeling? I agree with you. Somebody who's drafted you and who has been in your corner is now suddenly not going to be the final decision maker on roster choices. That can't be a good thing for Drew.
And I think that I actually disagree with you. I think they're more likely to draft somebody now. I think going into yesterday I would have said they're more likely to sign a free agent because John's been in place. There was pressure on John, I think, to win and win now and get this team back to the playoffs. I think when you have a new GM, it almost resets the clock a little bit. I think you want to get back there as soon as possible, but I think the GM, kind of earns the right to say, hey, I want to do it with my QB and see what happens here. And so if that means, you really like Zach Wilson and you're going to get him at 9, or you're going to move up a couple spots to get him there, and that's who you're going to roll with, I think there's a little more patience there, and that a new GM, someone who's just getting in there, is less likely to be like, I'm going to risk everything on getting Matt Stafford and having to win this year. Because if you make a big move like that and you spend all that money and that draft capital and it doesn't work out in year one and you're not back in the playoffs, I think it's a bad start to your tenure. Whereas I think you can weather a young quarterback a little bit. And so that's why, if the GM does believe in Drew and maybe they find somebody who really believes in Drew's talent and will move forward with him, I think there'll be a little bit of leeway there. And the same thing, they decide they want to draft a rookie. I will say, Phil, and we'll talk about Vaughn and Justin in just a second, but the first question I think to these GMs is going to be, what is your plan at quarterback? And so I think they'll have a decent idea when they hire somebody. Are they going to stick with Drew? Are they going to look in the draft? Are they going to go to free agency? Because that's the biggest question that's faced this franchise for 5 years. And so whoever is the new GM is going to have a plan for that.
That's why I kind of, when we initially started talking about the GM opening, it doesn't feel like a fresh start to me. Even though that GM is coming in and it's going to be a new beginning with that GM, it doesn't feel like a total restart, though. The same way as, like we mentioned, a GM coming in, to Jacksonville. Okay, they have the number 1 pick. They're starting fresh. They're heading in a brand new direction. Doesn't quite feel like that. So, restarting the clock, like you said there, to me, doesn't necessarily make sense with considering that the head coach has been here for 2 years. John has been here obviously since 2011. It doesn't quite feel like a completely fresh start in my mind, but obviously that is going to be part of the interview process, Eric. And, they're going to want to hear what this person has to say about Drew when they're interviewing him, and I know John said there's not going to be any stipulations or anything like that for a GM, but they're probably thinking, okay, we've invested in this young quarterback. What do you think? What do you think of him? How would you evaluate him? How would you suggest moving forward with this roster? And the answers are going to determine a lot there. But once they've determined what they want to do with the quarterback position, then they got to make a decision on Vaughn here. Vaughn obviously heading into the final year of his contract, but nothing guaranteed for Vaughn. So they could decide to move on, right, Eric?
Yeah, that's right. There's a team option essentially, and I believe the number is somewhere around 18 million that they'd have to pick up for this season. If they choose not to do that, they could restructure his contract for 1 year. They could extend him, which would lower his cap hit, but obviously keep him here for a few more years. Listening to John speak on Monday, it kind of sounded like that was maybe the route they would take, that they wouldn't be able to pick up or that they wouldn't pick up the option, but that they would extend him, because John said, we want Vaughn to finish his career here. And Vaughn's going to play more than 1 more year, I would assume. We've had no indication that he's close to ready to hang it up. So when he says we want Vaughn to finish his career here, we're hoping we can get that, figured out. To me, that means maybe a 2 or 3 year extension on top of this year that lowers the cap hit. And if Vaughn's willing to do that, I think the Broncos would be open to it. I think it's clear that he can still be a nice complementary piece to Bradley Chubb. Maybe he does have one more elite year yet, one more elite year left that we'll have to see after he comes back from this ankle injury. But he's still a valuable pass rush, a valuable leader, a valuable player on this team. So if you can get it done with an extension or something like that, I think it's a good idea. I think the GM would be open to it, no matter who it is, because Von Miller's a good player. But I'm just not sure it's going to happen at the price of the team option. And to me, Phil, the way I look at it is that I kind of thought Drew would be the quarterback, Vaughn would not be back, and Justin Simmons will be back in some regard. I think my second two there, the Justin and the Vaughn, I don't think those necessarily change because of the GM. The Drew one is the only one that I think changes.
See, that's what I was going to ask you was, somebody asked John today in his press conference about Von Miller, and he said he wants Von Miller to finish his career here in Denver. But at the same time, that's not John's decision anymore, which is it's weird to think about that, because we're so used to asking John about the roster. Well, is it John's decision then if Vaughn comes back, or is it the new GM's? Sort of a weird, that is going to have to be something that gets figured out here moving forward, is how does that balance work? I would argue that a player of Vaughn's stature is big picture, and maybe John gives his input and then the GM makes the final decision. I'm assuming that's how it would work with somebody like Vaughn. And, I do think that it depends on what kind of, fiscal mindset this new general manager has. Maybe he doesn't believe in making sentimental decisions. We've seen John ask a player like Peyton Manning to make a pay cut. We know that he here to make the best decision for the Broncos moving forward. And I'm with you, Eric. I don't think that it's going to be at that team option, but I do think that the Broncos figure out a way to get Vaughn back. I do think that even hearing what Vic Fangio had to say about Vaughn, I think he was asked last week about it, and he was like, I think Vaughn last offseason had a heck of an offseason, was coming in ready to have a monster season, obviously got hurt. He thought that if Vaughn takes that same mindset to this offseason, there's no reason why he couldn't come back in 2021 and still be primed for a monster season.
Yeah, I just think that the decision has to be the GMs and Vic Fangio's, and mainly the GMs. It can't be a John saying, "Hey, you're here and you get to make decisions, but I'm gonna make the call on this one," because then you're starting off on the wrong.
You just cited John Elway's comments on whether or not you think Vaughn will be back next year. I mean,
well, I think that that's more of a reflection of where the organization stands currently. But if the new GM comes in and decides, from what I saw on tape or what we've got to spend resources otherwise, John can't step in the first month that the guy's on the job and say, this is what we're going to do. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly.
I will say, Phil, as we're recording this, our friend Mike Kliss has reported that it's not likely Peyton Manning will be a candidate. Elway told 9 News, a lot of people have called, but Peyton has not called. So,
well, maybe Elway will call him. So
maybe.
Unless he specifically asked, do you plan on calling Peyton Manning? Which it doesn't sound like he asked that specific question.
Yeah, you're going to hold on to this as long as you can, aren't you?
But what if?
And I said 1 second ago that I thought maybe it doesn't impact Justin Simmons's situation here. I think maybe actually there's a better chance that Justin Simmons returns in 2021 now.
Why do you say that, Eric?
Because I think that know
we're playing off each other. I like it. I see.
I think we know that John has John likes to play hardball. He drives a hard negotiation. We've seen some of these extensions take some time. Von Miller, it was contentious at times. Maybe the new GM is just a fresh start between Justin Simmons' representation and the Broncos. We don't know. I don't know how much control the GM would have over, like, for example, the Broncos cap guy in Rich Hurtado, if they would, fill out that whole part of the organization. But I just think having a GM with a fresh approach, maybe that helps. And obviously, Garrett Bowles had to wait. Justin Simmons had to play out the year on the franchise tag. Maybe a different approach there in terms of extensions could help as guys like Cortland Sutton and Noah Fant and Bradley Chubb start approaching those needed extensions.
And look, I think that the overall philosophy to some of these decisions, they're going to be connected here. Like if the Broncos go out and make a trade for a veteran quarterback, well, now there's not so much money to pay these other guys. If they take Von Miller's option as it's currently structured, okay, now there's not so much money for Justin Simmons. So these guys are all connected. I think that they're going to have to make some tough decisions. There's not enough to go around to everybody. So they're going to have to make some decisions here. Justin Simmons talked to the media on Monday. He did not sound the same way that he sounded at the end of last season, Eric. This time for example, at the end of his press conference, he thanked all the media. There was a very much of a goodbye feeling to it. Now he didn't say that for example, his Instagram post, it had a definite goodbye feeling, but he said that wasn't what it was. But you almost had to read in between the lines a little bit when you were listening to Justin. You could tell that he was not necessarily thrilled that he had to play on the franchise tag this year. Sounded like to me he wasn't really interested in doing that next season, but he just didn't want to come out and say those words in as much.
Yeah, I mean, the negotiations are still in the very, very early stages. They're just allowed to start talking to each other again today, I believe, since the regular season is over. But yeah, I agree with you on all those things. It had a different feel, and that's why I think maybe this change can represent a shift in that tone, because it did not sound like Justin was very hopeful that something was going to get done long term. Maybe that changes now.
But Eric, I do believe that John Elway, it was reported somewhere that he did have a team Zoom meeting. So unclear if when Justin met the press, if he already knew about John Elway, the news about John Elway or not. Was that your take on it there?
My understanding was the Zoom meeting was with his staff, not the team, but
Oh,
maybe
not the
I
team. Got
saw
it.
a different.
Oh, maybe that's true. Sorry, maybe I mixed that up there. But um, regardless, John Elway is going to still be the president of football operations. So, like, if there was bad blood there, I don't necessarily know that completely goes away. But what I do know is that the Broncos have the option to franchise tag Justin Simmons again if they want to, or they can get a long-term deal done. And with the way Justin played last year, certainly the price of another franchise tag, it goes up from the first year franchise tag, but it's definitely still in play.
Sure, definitely. It's not out of the question by any means. And, I just think that even if those negotiations haven't gone well, it could just be a chance to reset everything. You see some teams, Phil, where they hand out extensions all the time and it's very quick and it feels very easy. That's not necessarily the best way to do things either. I think John is very careful with who he extends, and we've seen guys leave Denver without an extension that have ended up playing poorly where they've gone. And it's been the right call to not make those deals based on being sentimental or whatever the case may be. But obviously, Justin's a good player. The thing that'll be interesting to me is with some of these decisions, Phil, the GM might be less likely to make a win now decision compared to Vic Fangio, because Vic Fangio will be going into year 3 with 11 wins under his belt and might say, 12 wins under his belt, and might say, we got to win this year in order for me to remain the head coach long term. Whereas the GM might look at it and say, it's year 1 for me. I've got time to figure this out. And so that becomes an interesting dynamic when you're talking about, do we keep Justin? Do we re-sign Vaughn? Do we move forward with a veteran quarterback or drafting a quarterback or Drew? Those things all will come into play.
That's what I'm saying. It doesn't feel like a fresh start. It sort of feels like it's still a similar regime here. It's just that one integral part is swapping out, but still remains, so.
It feels like a transition to me in that I think within a couple of years, I think it will very much feel like the new GM's team.
Yes, but it's going to take some time to get to that point. And I do think that Vic, it's not like these two are operating on islands here. They've got to be together on it. And it can't be the type of situation where the GM feels like he's got time. If Vic doesn't feel like he has time, like those guys got to be on the same page about the overall direction that the team is heading in. And that's one of the other reasons why I feel like Drew is likely to return here, is that it feels like there's direction with this team right now. Yes, 5-11 is not getting the job done. Yes, it doesn't feel like this team is close to winning it all right now. Yes, it's a 4th consecutive losing season, but it feels like, I guess I'll put it this way. I don't think all 5-11 teams are built the same. Just because they went 5-11 doesn't mean that they're the same as another 5-11 team. It feels like this team with some continuity is heading in the right direction. I hope that this move at general manager doesn't disrupt that. We talk about continuity. Well, building a roster, you need some continuity too, and it feels like the Broncos had a vision for the type of players they were picking here. You don't know if that was all John Elway or if that had Vic Fangio's thumbprint on it, but it definitely seemed like this team, it was building a certain type of characteristic. They wanted young, athletic offensive weapons to build around Drew Lock. They started to get that together a little bit there at the end of the season. They certainly have some big decisions on defense, but it seemed like this team was heading in a direction. You just wonder how much continuity from John Elway's football philosophies are going to be incorporated into this new general managers.
Yeah, no, I do think that there have been some strides taken. I also think there's value in taking some of the, regardless of who plays quarterback, Jerry Jeudy is a good football player that you want on your team. Regardless of who plays quarterback, Noah Fant is a good football player that you want on your team. I think there are pieces here that will remain no matter what, the same way there are in any rebuild. But again, the GM who comes in is going to have to give their honest opinion and say, is this team close to being, Arthur Blank said this today in Atlanta. He said we were, 5-11 or 4-12 or whatever they finished at. But he said, when I look at this team, I feel like we're on the edge of being 7-9 or 8-8. We're not on the edge of being 11-5 or 12-4 and actually competing for a title. So I think whoever comes in has to be realistic and say, is this a 5-11 team that can realistically compete with the Chiefs within a couple of years? Or is this a 5-11 team that's the way it's constructed currently, or with the quarterback it has? Is this a 5-11 team that is going to be 9-7 at best and fight for a wild card spot every year? And, it might not be the answer you want to hear, or Broncos country want to hear, if the new GM does think you're closer to that 8-8, 9-7 team. I mean, to me, Phil, even if guys were healthy, the way that some key players played at certain times, this was not a team that was going to win 12 games or 13 games. They were a team that could probably have won 8 and maybe have pushed for 9, but Phil, it took 11 wins to get into the playoffs this year. I'm not sure that would have happened even if everybody was healthy.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like not having that consistent play from the offensive perspective, definitely. The turnovers, those types of things, that this team wasn't close to getting to 11 wins. Even if Cortland Sutton is there, or even if Von Miller is healthy, I do think that they would be better. And I do think that with another offseason heading into next year, the growth that's going to take place with this offense is going to be exponential. I don't think that you could just say, okay, this team wasn't close this year, so we've got to make huge changes this offseason. I think it's okay to say, we feel like we've got some legitimate talent here. We just need some time for it to come together and grow. I guess it's kind of like if you plant a tree in your front yard. If you plant a young tree that you think is going to grow and become a beautiful tree in 10 years, you stick with that tree. But if you have a different philosophy and you're like, I want a big tree right now, and I'm going to go spend the money to plant a huge tree, you just got to decide, do we need to do this now, or do we need to let it grow? And I say you let it grow, Eric. There's some holes. There's some holes in that metaphor, I think.
Yeah, doesn't that then say you would be more open to drafting a quarterback than going out and signing a free agent?
No, I would say that those are the two decisions. If you want to let a tree grow, you stick with what you got right now. If you want to win right now, you go out and buy a big tree, and the big tree is Matt Stafford.
What if you want to let a newer young tree grow that you think will be taller than the current tree you have planted?
Then that's the really long play, because think about it. Drew Lock is 2 years into his development, and next year it'll be a third year into his development. You're saying third year Drew Lock, we don't want that. We want first year Zach Wilson.
I'm not necessarily, but I do think that there are some people that would say first year Justin Herbert with 10 starts was a better option.
Yeah. I mean, some people might think that.
Not us, Phil. We're just saying some people might think that.
Some people. That's what you were saying, right?
What
I believe you just said some people might think that Justin Herbert, first year Justin Herbert.
That fake tree behind you, what does that fall into?
First of all, that's a real tree. Okay.
I've been told potential GM candidates that it's fake.
No.
I've heard that.
That's incorrect, though.
No, I mean, I think in general you're right that there needs to be some consistency, but I just think this is a chance, Phil, to, as you're hiring a GM, to have an open and honest evaluation about where the team is. And I think that the Broncos did a better job of that when they hired Vic Fangio than when they hired Vance Joseph. When they hired Vance Joseph, the idea was it's not a reboot, or it's not a rebuild, it's a reboot, or something like that. It's we can win right now. We can.
How did he say it? How did he say it, Eric?
Yeah, I can't quite remember.
I want that. I want an impression.
But it was. They thought they could be right back at it. I think when they hired when they hired Vic, there was an acknowledgement this might take a little bit of time. And I think the same thing with the GM has to be acknowledged, that you might have to say, hey, I know it's been 5 years since we made the playoffs, but to build this thing correctly, it might take another year or two, and you might have to follow that vision. And the new GM is going to have to say, hey, are we on a trajectory where with an offseason and another draft and another free agent crop, we're going to be at 9 wins and then we can get to competing with the Chiefs the year after that? Or does the GM say, like, I like some of the things we've done, but in other ways, we're not building the secondary the right way, for example. Do they have to make those decisions? And I think whoever they hired will be allowed to make those decisions. I really think John has decided that, he's willing to step back to get a fresh approach to get the team back to the playoffs. And that to me is why I think maybe it's less likely that it's an Adam Peters or a guy like that has been part of the regime before.
But he is part of the hiring process.
I understand that. Yeah.
So I'm assuming he's going to say, what do you think about the quarterback position and what's your philosophy there with us moving forward? And depending on his answer in the interview process might determine whether or not he's hired. So if this guy's like, oh, I want to blow this up and I want to bring in, I want to draft a new quarterback, and John doesn't necessarily agree with that big picture vision, maybe that guy's not going to get hired.
Yeah, but maybe they do it another way where they say they do all these interviews and they pick the person that they think has the best overall vision, and that person happens to want to draft a quarterback, and so that's what they do. I mean, it's just we'll have to see what the approach is.
And I guess if they went in that direction, Eric, that would say that they believe more in that GM as a talent evaluator moving forward than they currently do in their own evaluation of Drew Lock moving forward. They would say, okay, we hear your vision. We believe in you as the general manager moving forward more than we believe in Drew Lock as a quarterback moving forward.
I guess so.
No, I mean, that's true, right? Like if they say, we want to hire this GM whose plan is to come in here and blow this up, then that means that they believe more in that GM's abilities than they do the current roster.
Or more that they're just committing to that vision more, because you're making more of a commitment to a GM that you're hiring on a 4 or 5 year contract than you are to Drew Lock, who will be in year 3 as a second round draft pick.
Yeah.
There's more investment in the former.
And we know that this is regardless a huge year for Drew Lock. So, I mean, whatever ends up happening, it's going to be a big year for Drew Lock.
And there might be a guy that comes in and says, hey, Drew is I really like what I see on tape, or we can work with him. All we're saying is that when you add someone new to the mix who was not involved in that evaluation process initially, there's no longer a tie there. And that makes things he's on a little bit shakier ground.
Yes. And that new GM is going to have final roster decision. So, a crazy day here on this Monday for the Broncos is we find out that GM, President of Football Operations, John Elway, is taking a reduced workload, but somehow is a promotion, Eric.
I want that.
I like that. Less work, promoted. That's the dream right there. Somebody tweeted, I liked it. It said, John Elway promoted himself and gave him less work to do. And, that's a boss move, it is a boss move. Yeah. Like that's what you want. That's what you want to do. So Eric, one thing though is for sure with this Broncos team, there's never a dull moment when the season ends. It's like how many years in a row now something happens. Last year it was the offensive coordinator. The year before that, it was the head coach. A couple years before that, it was Gary Kubiak stepping down. I mean, there's just always something going on with this Broncos team.
It's true.
Keeps you on your toes.
Keep covering it, Phil.
Yeah.
We'll keep breaking it down.
Well, I'm sure that we'll explore more of the GM candidates here in the next couple of weeks. John Elway didn't really put a timetable on it per se, but he said that they're definitely already getting to work here trying to figure out the next candidate. So we'll be all over it, Eric.
Yes, we will.
And we'll be back a little bit later this week. I think we still are planning to do some Zony Awards where we hand out some awards from what happened this past season. Eric, we're going to have to make some T-shirts or something like that.
Yeah, that'll be nice.
If Justin Simmons wins a Zony, what are we going to give him?
I don't know. That might factor into the negotiations.
We might have to give a Zony to the wide receiver coach.
It's pretty good.
Zakazani.
Yeah.
All right, but we'll be back later this week. We'll dive into more of what happened this season, wrap up the season. Today, not a traditional end of season type of press conference, obviously much bigger news to get to. So we'll be back a little bit later in the week. Until then, for Eric Dalala, I'm Phil Milani, and this has been The Neutral Zone.
This is Bronco Batman, and you're listening to The Neutral Zone.